Elon would actually be happy to see the tax credit scrapped.
IRA is projected to help U.S. Reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 1 billion tons annually by 2030. It's the biggest climate bill in the U.S. history.
This conversation about the Inflation Reduction Act and the economic opportunity is there.
IRA has already catalyzed about $200 billion in private investments. Climate policy is bad for the economy.
That's 100% a myth.
You're listening to Climate Conversations with Divya, brought to you by Purple Fix Productions. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Climate Conversations. Now, you've probably heard about the Inflation Reduction Act. If not, don't worry, we'll talk about it soon. But it's the biggest climate bill in the US history, if I may put it so, and Tim can correct me if I'm wrong. But here is the question. Is this the climate superhero we've been waiting for, or is it just another overhyped blockbuster with a big budget and mediocre results? So to help us unpack this, I'm thrilled to welcome Tim McDonnell, a journalist who's been covering climate policy and energy for over a decade. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to be here.
Super. So before we dive in, I always like to start with something personal. You've been reporting on climate for years. How has covering something so massive and, let's face it, overwhelming, changed the way you look at the world?
Wow. Diving right in. Good question to start on. I mean, I think that climate change and the energy transition affects all aspects of human life and civilization in many different and sometimes unexpected ways, more less expected ways. Being in the middle of this for the last 10 years and thinking ahead to what the next decade is going to hold as we move closer to net zero, I really feel like we're living through an unprecedented moment in human history in terms of the scale of the change with our energy system and the speed at which that's happening. And people can use this metaphor of rebuilding the airplane while you're flying in it. And that's kind of where we're at. And so for me personally, to answer your question, I guess, living through climate change and the transition, I think has really taught me a lot of empathy. And that's probably the most important thing that I take away from it, because there's a lot of people whose lives are upended in one or another by what we're going through. In some cases for the better. I mean, there are opportunities here as well, which connects obviously to this conversation about the Inflation Reduction Act and what the economic opportunity is there. But I think overall, I take away empathy from my work on this, because it's been hard for a lot of people. We're all kind of trying in different ways. We have to be kind to each other still too. So that's kind of just started on a mushy note like that, I guess.
That's very beautiful. And now that we've touched upon something so light, I would love for you to share with the audience your background on this, which I know should have been the first question, but I wanted to start with why it means so much to you, how it has changed you, and then go on to, well, who are you, Tim?
Who am I?
What's your background?
Who knows? I'm the energy and climate editor of Semaphore, which is a 2-year-old politics and business magazine based in New York and DC, but with a presence all over the world. And I have a newsletter on the energy transition and climate politics, mostly in the US and Europe, that comes out twice a week and has a bunch of different stories on this subject in there. And that's the product of, I've been doing climate journalism, as you said, for more than 10 years and for a bunch of different publications, and lived in different parts of the world covering this story. I currently live right now in Kyiv in Ukraine. That's where you're getting me from. My wife is the Washington Post correspondent here covering the war. So I'm here because of her job, but I also write a lot about Ukraine's energy security crisis. It's obviously a really important part of the war here that we could talk about in more detail if you want. But
Absolutely.
So that's kind of what I'm doing these days. Yeah, I've been covering energy for 10 years. So it's been a wild ride.
That is super. I mean, it's quite a background, and honestly, strength to you and your wife for covering such an important topic back in Ukraine. I can't imagine it being easy at all, witnessing so many things happening around you. But, I want to do something a little different today. Usually I go on to quantifying the impact part of the section quite like in the middle. But today I want to touch upon why should people care? Like, how does it impact them before we get into the subject of what even is IRA? What is this Inflation Reduction Act? Before getting into it, let's give people the goodies. How do you imagine this in terms of numbers? And do not feel too much pressure about it. It's conversation. We'll be volleying a little bit here and there. I'd love to know your thoughts first and share mine, and let's see if numbers make sense to both of us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why should people care about the Inflation Reduction Act? This, I think you said before, this is definitely the biggest piece of climate legislation in U.S. history by far. And there's some people in Congress are annoyed to hear that description. They don't like to think of it as a climate bill, but more of a bill. That's how it was pitched originally. But anyway, I mean, at the end of the day, it is a climate bill because it's about the energy system, and it's about making investments in the types of technologies and industrial facilities and also consumer products and other things that are the technologies of the future and are going to be the cornerstone of every country's economy in the future. They are critical for the economic competitiveness of the US and for every other country. And so this is basically a bill or a law that really changes the game entirely for how the US approaches energy, how the US approaches climate change, and how links that are being forged here in a totally new way between the economy and climate action. Because, very brief history note aside, previously in the US, the US policy had always approached climate as a problem for regulation, something you had to kind of, we have to chase down emissions and limit them, put caps on emissions from power plants or cars or things like that. It was a regulatory problem. People used kind of carrots and sticks analogy. So, this always used sticks. Inflation Reduction Act is like a huge, huge, huge bag of carrots. And it's a totally new approach that I think was designed that way, both because it is important for the US economy, but also because forging this link between climate action and economics was done intentionally by the Biden administration to make this bill more attractive to Republicans, to make it get more kind of bipartisan support and also more durability and staying power in case we have, for example, Donald Trump being reelected president. So that link, a sort of industrial policy link, is really important here. But I think bottom line, end of the day, why should we care about this? This is the U.S. answer to the climate crisis. And so it's multifaceted. But if climate and the U.S. economy are subjects that people care about, then you definitely have to care about the Inflation Reduction Act.
That's very well put. Gives people a lot to think about. But also, what caught my eye, I was researching and I came across Princeton Repeat Project, and they mentioned that IRA is projected to help US reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 1 billion tons annually by 2030. And to put that into context of what it means for the world emissions, so overall we need to reduce our total emissions by 51 billion tons, which makes it about 2% of global emissions. And honestly, when people think about, 2%, that's a small amount, it really is not. I've been saying that from the beginning, like every percentage counts. Given that US emits about 6 billion tons annually, which is according to an EPA report, again, it's not insignificant when you put it into comparison, when you put it into the big picture. Across electric power, it's across transportation, it's across buildings and industries, like you already mentioned. Tax and incentive for energy efficient retrofits and heat pumps would decarbonize 40% of US buildings by 2035 or so. What I mean here is the burden of fighting climate change overall has been, the context has always been put on like individual levels most of the times, right? Like, what are you doing to save the planet? But to get a government involved at such a level, especially the US, it's not been seen before. It's very common here in Europe. It's very common here in Paris. You have all these laws that help protect the environment, that help put things in context for people. But I think it's a big step because people look up to the United States, at least historically.
Yeah, I mean, I think also that if you want to think about the emissions impact of a law like this, I mean, the Princeton study is amazing. Those guys are great. They do a lot of great work. And so that's the piece of it that's like emissions reductions within the borders of the U.S., which is important for all the reasons that you mentioned. But the other impact of this law is that it really has international emissions reductions built into it as well, because what we're doing here is incentivizing the development of new industries and new technologies. The more the U.S. is involved in everything, manufacturing solar panels and EV batteries to getting more involved in really cutting edge stuff with sustainable aviation fuels or geothermal energy, advanced nuclear or whatever, like all the, carbon capture. That's all technology that the U.S. is going to, and products that the U.S. is exporting around the world, lowering the costs of production. And so I think it's hard to say at this point on what is the global emission reduction that can be achieved when the U.S. is more proactive as a manufacturer of clean technologies, and as a consumer of them. But that is also a very important piece of this, right? Because it's not just about what we achieve kind of within the borders of the U.S. It's also about becoming more competitive in the global energy transition marketplace and driving down the costs of these technologies for everyone. So that's another way to kind of think about this. It really is. It's part of the global picture, and I think it will be very impactful.
No, that's quite true. IRA has already catalyzed about $200 billion in private investments into these kinds of technologies, and I think that's all positive and upward looking.
Mm-hmm.
So always private investments, very good way to say, okay, we're going in the right direction. People are thinking about the right technologies.
Yeah, and I think we've just barely scratched the surface on that because there's a lot of private investment still that hasn't been. This law is only 2 years old.
Yeah,
it's not a lot of time for, if you're talking about getting final investment decision on a $500 million manufacturing facility. It takes time to do that, and there are other obstacles with like interest rates and sort of political uncertainty in the U.S. that have been not always like advantageous to making huge investments. So, the fact that amount of money you just mentioned is already out there is and has been invested is amazing. That's just the beginning of the process. I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see a huge increase on that, obviously with some uncertainty there, depending on what we see come out of the Trump administration that could change some of these policies. And we can talk about that.
Absolutely. Let's do that. IRA has been called a lot of things. Transformational, game changer, and sometimes even the last best chance for U.S. climate leadership. Politics being politics, it's not exactly smooth sailing. So what parts of the IRA are most at risk, if I may put it so, under the current Republican-led Congress?
Mm-hmm. I think definitely the federal tax credit for electric vehicle purchases, which is it's like up to $7,500 for EVs that you get back, depending on some different kind of caveats. Basically, $7,500 off of EVs. That one is not popular. I think there's a lot of Republicans that view that too much as a giveaway to China because a lot of the part batteries and stuff are coming from China, and some people think that the rules about domestic content requirements have not been tight enough for that. But anyway, that one is probably not long for this world, I think. And interestingly, we've all kind of seen this like bromance happening between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, the Tesla CEO. And you might think that Elon would be in Trump's ear about saving that tax credit, but actually, I think that Tesla's point of view on this, Tesla is half of the US EV market. They're much more competitive and kind of stable in what they're doing than Ford or GM or these other like legacy Detroit automakers. And those are the guys, the Detroit guys, the Fords and the GMs that really benefit from this tax credit because they're trying to make their EV products from scratch and are really struggling to stand up that part of their businesses. Tesla is more mature, and I think Elon would actually be happy to see the tax credit scrapped because it would hurt his competitors more than it would hurt him. But anyway, so that's one that, might go.
That is a mind-blowing thing that you mentioned for me, because I would have imagined like the simplicity factor things. Like, of course, it would benefit Elon, so Elon would go for it. But then
Yeah.
adding this fact about, oh, it would hurt his competitors more. And I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that he feels that he needs it. I mean, in Elon is competing with, or Tesla is competing with those legacy automakers, but Teslas are expensive. They're not going for the low end of the market. They're not going for mass adoption in this of lower level cars the way that, Ford or GM, it's a market segment that they are maybe going for more. And Tesla is kind of going for a higher part of the market segment where buyers of Tesla, $7,500 tax credit is not always going to be the make or break kind of deal for them. They might buy it anyway. So I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to watch. But certainly in the next 4 years, we'll really see like the evolution of this Elon Donald bromance. Those are two like really huge egos to
Yeah.
have in a small space. So I would be surprised if they're still so buddy buddy at the end of 4 years. I'm sure that some massive blowout is coming soon, but we can watch the drama with popcorn.
It almost like it's actually one of the reasons that this podcast got started is whole bromance, as you put it, scared me and chilled me to the bone. It's a very dangerous combination and very powerful one at that.
Yeah.
But I also, just as a footnote, as a side note, because we were talking about EVs and the tax credit that people get out of it. This part from episode 3, my guest was Lucas Morris. He works here in Paris with Hello Tomorrow. And we had this entire conversation about how it's not exactly clean when you think about it in the long term, the kind of energy they're using versus the materials involved versus the longevity of the car and sort of how long does the person have to use the car to be able to have that benefit for the climate, for the energy versus their normal car.
Yeah. Yeah.
EVs by nature are not entirely clean, and I think that was like one of the blockbuster moments of that episode. So I feel compelled to mention this as a footnote here.
EVs are, they're only as clean as the power system that they're plugged into and the supply chain for minerals that they are based on. And
Very true.
all of those things can and should, need to be done better. So that's a big area of improvement for the time ahead, definitely.
If I remember correctly, in your article, you mentioned that a lot of IRA funding goes to Republican majority districts. I was definitely wondering why is that, and could it influence how Congress views the bill?
Definitely. It definitely will influence the way that Congress approaches the bill. And, why has the majority of Inflation Reduction Act, manufacturing tax credit incentives gone to Republican districts? You'd probably have to do some socio-historical research to really get a good answer to that question. I think in short, it's because the places where big factories for solar panels and batteries and stuff like that are being built tend to be rural areas. They are kind of places that are suburban, just by nature in the U.S. is just more likely to be Republican. They also are concentrated a lot in the southeastern part of the U.S., which also has a very strong Republican presence. And that's in part because it's a question of electricity access. They have a lot of cheap hydropower and cheap coal power down there and cheap solar, and it's close to the kind of industrial hub of the Gulf of Mexico and all of that stuff. So with, for imports and exports. And so I think there's a lot of, complex different reasons why that has been the case. But I think that the Biden administration anticipated that is what would happen. And when working with Congress to pass this law, I'm sure that there were many members of Congress on the Republican side who recognized the benefits for their district that could come out of this. And, people don't have to see it as, and, they often don't see it as something to do with emissions or the climate. It's just manufacturing. It's advanced manufacturing investment. That's what it is. So now the question is, how much is any of that going to matter in the new Congress? Because, you might say, well, nobody's going to vote against a tax credit that benefits their own district. And that's probably true most of the time, but climate is obviously still very ideologically charged and divisive for like political and ideological and cultural war reasons. And it's not, I wouldn't take it for granted that every single member of Congress is going to vote or make voting decisions about the Inflation Reduction Act in a strictly dollars and cents kind of way. There may be some ideology that factors into like which industries do we want to support, which tax credits do we want to support? And if you're someone who still really believes strongly in doubling down on the fossil fuel industry in the US and doing everything we can to support that, and then you may not want to support tax credits for, solar and wind, even though those have proven, or those have been resilient to different Congresses over the last decade or so. I mean, those existed before the Inflation Reduction Act. So anyway, I think that's going to be the big story. And Congress now at the beginning of the year is already starting work on the bills that they need to pass to fund the government and keep the government open. And that's the time when, if there's going to be an attack on tax credits, that this is the moment when that's going to happen. So I think in the next month or two, we will have a lot more information about what else is at risk and what the chances are and who is standing up for what, or is, so it's a little bit hard to say, but
yeah,
I think definitely there's a lot of things changed there. And the very last thing I'll say about this is just that the way that tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act are applied to different sectors, there's a lot of discretion for the executive branch, for the Department of the Treasury to make decisions, or the Energy Department to make decisions about how should we use this money, or how should we allow taxpayers in the US to access this money. And the Biden administration had their own approach to how they wanted to do that. And it's very possible that we could see something different under Trump. So it's not just Congress, it's also, there's going to be room for the Trump administration to potentially make changes to how these rules are applied that could make it harder to access some tax credits or take them away, or kind of change the interpretation so that they're more favorable to fossil fuels, or there's different ways that could change. So it's a really fascinating time covering the story, and a lot is going to be happening there soon.
Absolutely. Because we were talking about quantifying the impact a lot, and repealing the tax credits in general could add back as much as the annual emissions of Australia and Spain combined, which is close to 500 million tons of carbon dioxide annually. Also, I don't know what the political view on the loss of new jobs that are going to be created because of the IRA is, but it's about 170,000 plus clean energy jobs that are going to be at risk.
I don't think that, I think the extreme case of the entire, Inflation Reduction Act is repealed or something. I think that's almost certainly not going to happen. So it's going to be somewhere in the middle of the kind of zero impact versus the extreme, job loss or reversal of emissions that you just described. I think we'll probably end up somewhere in the middle there. Some of this definitely will survive. I mean, if I'm wrong about that, you can have me back on the show in a year and I'll eat my words, but I really don't think that the whole thing is at risk. That would really shock me.
I think my listeners as well would love to have you back on the show. Because this has been a very interesting conversation so far. I was super excited about the IRA because it's taking 200 million cars off the road. If you think about EPA equivalency, or shutting down 250 coal-fired power plants. I'm hoping I'm not sort of offending any sentimentalities of certain states in the US.
No, you're good.
I love, that you did your prediction right now, because it's a very smooth sailing transition for me into the next segment of the podcast, Myths and Controversy. Is it myth, controversy, or a fact? Are you ready for it?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Super. Let's start with the first one. Climate policy is bad for the economy.
That's 100% a myth. That myth has been, that I would take it beyond, I would use even a stronger word than myth and call that propaganda, because that's a, marketing language that, has been bandied by fossil fuel executives and their trade groups and allies in the halls of Congress for many years. It's totally not true. if you look at what's happening let's just look at what's happening in China right now. They have a surging industry around all of these clean energy technologies. It is where the future is going. And you don't have to see it as climate action. I mean, it's actually like counterproductive in some cases to view this as a climate mandate. I mean, it's a clean energy, having different kinds of distributed energy resources, advanced energy resources is just better, like in every way almost than fossil fuels and in the way we've used them historically. So from an environmental point of view, an economic point of view. So, I think from a public health point of view, from a energy cost and reliability point of view, there are some bumps in this transition, and it's not completely smooth sailing. But fundamentally, is there a conflict, an inherent conflict between climate and economic growth? The answer is clearly no. So, and that's, I think that point is becoming less controversial as time goes on, which is good to see.
They should really have you do marketing for climate action in general, because you've taken the divisive charge out of it by mentioning, okay, well, this is why it's beneficial. You don't even have to think about the climate, because it almost became an inflection point in our society to talk about these issues.
One more thing here too, which is important, which is that the other reason why this is a myth is because the kind of no action case, if you say, what's the economic cost of acting on climate change? Okay, we can talk about that. But what's the economic cost of not acting on climate change? And I think that, the way that kind of tension is usually framed, if you're hearing it from oil executive or whoever, is that the zero action case has no cost. We can just sit around and do nothing, and it will have no cost to society. But just look at, what's happening in California over the last week, and it's obvious that that's not true. I mean, that's $150 billion in economic losses from those fires, not to mention all the, people's lives that were upended or ended in different ways. You can't just say, oh, there's a cost to acting on climate change and therefore we shouldn't do it, because there's a much greater cost in terms of dollars and cents in not acting on climate change. So that's really like that's why this is sort of like a logical fallacy, because I mean, there's no option for us to take a course of action that has zero cost. Yeah. We have to pay one way or the other. It's just which one is going to benefit society more is clearly by embracing the energy transition. So that's where, that's where I think you need to come at it.
I really want to put this quote out on billboards now. I really want to put it out on billboards. It's just like, okay, look, I've simplified this for you. Can you please understand this now? No, but you're still very correct. Given the IRA already catalyzed $200 billion in private investment, I think it's a huge testimony to why that statement is so wrong. Let's go on to the second one. Are you ready?
Yep.
Climate policy can't withstand political changes.
I wouldn't call that a myth. I think that has been often proven to be true. I would say that it's true, but there's more to the story than that. Historically in the US, climate policy has fallen by the wayside or been changed from going usually from Democratic to Republican administration. And if you go back to Obama, and what Obama tried to do was very, stick-based on climate and not carrot-based. We have something called the Clean Power Plan that was Obama's big climate thing, and it was about, reducing emissions from power plants. They worked really hard on it, and it was a nice piece of regulation, but then it got destroyed in the courts. And when Trump got elected, they just threw it in the trash, basically. Biden had to go back to pretty much to zero when he, starting that one from scratch again. So it is true that there are that there are parts of this that can be affected. And I think that we will see with Trump's second term now that some of the regulations on power plant and vehicle emissions that were rolled out by Biden also will probably go back to the dustbin again, unfortunately. The other piece of this is that the Inflation Reduction Act, this is sort of Biden's, I think, legacy on climate overall, is to chart out a way to make climate policy more resilient to political change by connecting it to industrial policy, connecting it to the economy in a way that hadn't been done in the US before. for all of the reasons that we've talked about with these, investment in Republican districts. And there's plenty of stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act that directly goes into the pockets of fossil fuel companies because they're getting credits for investing in hydrogen and carbon capture and like some of these other advanced technologies that they are super keen to be involved with, and they love that. Everybody loves it.
Yeah.
So I think there is a way for this stuff to be more resilient. And I think the thing I'll say about this is, no matter what happens with these tax credits, I think the private sector in the US is going to continue to steam ahead. And I think there's not many on clean energy. I don't think there are many people, I rarely meet anyone who's investing in the energy transition who says, I only want to do this because of this tax credit. Like most of these investments are economic on their own without tax credit support. That just kind of sweeten the deal for a lot of these cases. So I don't think there's going to be some kind of huge reversal by investors or private sector on any of this stuff because they see the direction of travel. And so even if there is a change to climate policy in this new administration, I don't think that it's like the end of the transition for the US.
Yeah, that reminds me of when I was younger, I was quite naive. Everyone's naive when they're younger, but I was quite naive, and I thought, like, every time when someone's elected, why aren't they treated the same as one's treated at a job? You have a training period, get on with like the mission, vision statement of the company, so you're well aligned, you know what to do, and you have the correct skill sets, and then you have a probation period, right? Like if you're not doing well for the first 3 months, goodbye. At the end of the day, it's a job, you're getting paid. It's a job with responsibilities. Again, there's like extreme naivete to this because this whole thing about like somebody sort of trying to work on climate action and then you have someone repeating the entire thing, throwing it out in the bin. Then someone starting from square one, again, trying to rebuild it. It's like when the kids are playing and somebody's trying to build those houses and somebody comes and like destroys it and then you're trying to build it again. It's just like an incy spider thing.
Well, this is, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice kind of situation.
I want to throw that on a pillow.
Please do.
Add music to it and everything.
MLK would approve, but this is democracy. So it's it's not I don't think anybody thinks that this is the most direct or efficient way of getting anything done. But U.S. is a big country. People have a lot of different views about what our priorities should be. I think that as we've been saying, we can just sort of hope that over time, and I do think this is happening, that the divergence of opinion over the energy transition is shrinking because people see that it doesn't have to just be about emissions. This is an economic issue. I think hopefully we'll see a little bit less like flip-flopping between administrations in the future over this. We'll see. But yeah, no, it's definitely not the easiest way to get anything done.
I want to do a fun one now based on what you said very early on in the podcast about the bromance. Do you think it's going to fizzle out or end in pain or disaster? Enter a Taylor Swift sort of line here. I forgot the lyrics here.
If you look, just look at both of those guys. These are just very big personalities, big egos. Trump, the last time Trump was in office, there are about 100 examples you can point to where somebody that he thought was his friend, said something he didn't like, started to seem like they were disloyal or whatever. They find reasons they get into little personal disputes and then you're out. It's like Mean Girls. You're just in the burn book at that point. And there are it's like very vanishingly few people in Donald Trump's life who have, sustained very long-term, close, influential relationships with him, without having to kind of subjugate their own ambition and ego to his. And if some people are fine to do that, but Elon Musk is not one of those people, I don't think. I don't know the guy, but doesn't seem like the type of person who can play second fiddle to Trump forever. So I think he has his own ego issues and ambitions. So I just don't see how over the course of years that they'll stick together. But hey, what do I know? Maybe I'll be wrong too. That's one to watch. And yeah,
you're still not wrong about the first thing, so let's just wait and see. Musk's kind of the guy who plays the long game, right? There's always a long game involved. it scares me or chills me a little bit to think what the long game here could be, with this partnership. It's just suddenly it's just like a 180 in my head. Growing up, I really respected just the way someone's brain functioned and, the kind of hopes and
Mhm.
dreams they're bringing with the SpaceX or
Mhm.
with different aspects, advancing technology, advancing innovation and all of that. And then just suddenly you're like, okay, I don't know what's happening anymore. There's some long game at play, and somehow the recent, I don't know if you saw the recent video of Zuckerberg making the public announcements, and then suddenly feels like, wait, everyone's being attracted to a certain magnet over there and everyone's changing directions, and it's shocking. It makes me queasy and uncomfortable. Like, I don't know what's coming. It's like, when the dogs and the cats and the birds start running in the other direction because there's a storm coming or there's some natural disaster about to happen.
I think it's natural for executives to shift their kind of political alignment based on who they think is going to be in power. I mean, they often follow rather than lead on principle in that way, because that's what their, shareholders expect of them, want the company to do well. I have no idea what Musk's like long game is. And I'm not a Musk whisperer or anything very smart to say about his psychology, but I think that there's a lot of ways that that his companies can benefit from U.S. policy, whether it's Trump or somebody else, and it makes sense to like have an allegiance with the one who's in charge and winning. And I mean, don't forget that Tesla only exists because of a giant loan that it got from the U.S. government during the Biden administration, during the Obama administration. When Tesla was like a nothing company, just like a startup, and they got a grant they got financed from the Loan Programs Office in the U.S. Department of Energy. And that was the same around a similar time when the U.S. financed this solar company called Solyndra that went bankrupt, and it was like a huge scandal and whatever. And like people thought, oh, we shouldn't be like getting involved in financing any of these things. But at the same time, they also financed Tesla, which became like one of the biggest companies in the world, and so it can pan out. Elon like owes that success of that company to U.S. taxpayers. It's not just like his personal genius that made that happen.
I doubt his brain thinks about it the same
I'm
way.
not sure. I don't know. So anyway, that's about all I have to say about the about Musk.
That's fair. I don't know if I should poke the bear here or anything. Maybe we can like cut this out later or whatever. But this is something. It's more. I forgot the word for it. When it's a big speculation. It starts with the C. I don't know. My brain does that sometimes. The word when it's the moon flag thing. What is it called?
Conspiracy? A
The
conspiracy theory?
conspiracy theory. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my God. My brain
The
just like
moon
blanked out
thing.
certain words. Yeah, maybe it's that, but there was a lot of discussion going on behind, like in the grapevine. Initially, certain parts of California wanted to build a public transport system, and Musk went against it and said, oh, okay, no, I'm building the underground tunnels,
Yes.
put in the investment there. Instead, we're going to do the Hyperloop, etc. Didn't pan out. But of course, he knew he was, releasing his driverless vehicles, etc., which would be more beneficial. So,
Mhm.
really long-term game plan there. And now, what is behind on the grapevine again is okay. So he doesn't want investments really to go into saving the climate or saving the planet, or however you put it, into greener technologies, but rather would have people invest in going to the Mars. So there's a base issue that like, okay, I would like people to go to Mars, develop colonies there. So it's like more intraplanetary distance traveling versus saving your own planet kind of thing. And I don't know if you've been around those discussions at all. This is just like for my personal um
I have
insight.
no idea. Or that sounds totally plausible that he doesn't want to fight climate change because he wants us all to move to Mars. Sure. I mean, but you know what? It doesn't matter, honestly. We need EVs. We need like cheap solar, and we need cheap batteries. To its credit, Tesla still, is a market leader of those things. So I hope that he's able to like have, a reasonable uh sensible like relationship or influence on Trump. If it's all because he wants us to move to Mars, but we all get like $1,000 EVs out of it, then, whatever.
Is there any myth, controversy, anything that I haven't addressed that you'd like to address here that is like very exciting?
You were asking me like about busting myths, and I probably, because I know you like data and the numbers of this, and you may have talked about this on the show before, but I mean, there's an important myth that I think is worth around the energy transition that's always worth addressing, which is the primary energy fallacy. I don't know if you've come across that before,
No.
but basically this is just the idea that we have a certain amount of energy that's used to run the world, and most of it is coming from fossil fuels. And we need to transition to a world that is using a lot less fossil fuels. So people think about like, okay, how much wind and solar and batteries and advanced nuclear and hydro and geothermal and whatever low carbon stuff do we need to replace all of the fossil fuels? And if you do some math around that, if you think that you need the same amount of energy, then it starts to look kind of scary, because then that's when you start to get into, we're going to have huge solar farms that cover the entire Saharan desert, and we have to have giant offshore wind farms everywhere, and there's not enough space, there's not enough mineral resources to build all that stuff. It starts to make the energy transition look very scary and challenging. But the reality is that fossil fuels as an energy source are not very efficient, because you have to convert them into heat, and then you convert heat into usable energy. And when you have that heat stage, you lose a lot of it. And you lose actually like 2/3 of the energy. So if you think about like this sort of pipeline, like the funnel of fossil fuels up here, and then that you're putting in oil, gas, and coal at the top, and then getting energy services like the light bulb turns on or your car moves at the end. That funnel is really big, because so much of the energy is lost along the way, just like heat, it's just out into the atmosphere. But when you're using carbon, like advanced carbon energy, the funnel is much smaller, because you're just getting electricity. You're not wasting stuff through heat nearly as much. It means that the number that you start with of like total primary energy use by the world is a really big, but we don't need to convert that entire big number into clean energy. It's a much smaller number, because you don't lose so much of it along the way. So that's called the primary energy fallacy. It's an important myth,
Right.
I think, and it should make people feel more optimistic about achieving the energy transition. It's not quite scary as it might seem.
I really love that, because you can, in this way, think of renewables as a great band, and you need a good sound system, which would be the grid here, to amplify their music. And I know California had like a very good like solar system put in place. So usually the problem with these kind of systems is it has a load following problem, and that's how like the duck curve came.
Yeah, the duck
I
curve.
love it. Yeah, I love the duck curve completely.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the idea is to sort of reduce the hump of the duck, so that, of course, you can have like a stable energy throughout. And you do that by balancing by solar plus storage, etc., things of that sort that get you closer to meeting, like, let's say 80% of US's electricity needs by 2035. That's by Princeton Rupee Project, which I find quite interesting. But it's always in tandem. You need a certain flow between the two. But I love that you mentioned that. So let's zoom out. Think about this entire conversation we've had. What does the IRA's success or failure mean for US's climate leadership globally?
I mean, short answer. I mean, there's the emissions impact that you've mentioned. I mean, how much higher will emissions in the U.S. and around the world be if we don't pursue this kind of investment? There's the economic impact for the U.S. How much investment would be foregone or jobs lost by repealing IRA tax credits, and which would be significant. And then there's this sort of geopolitical. When I go to the COP climate summit every year. It was in Azerbaijan last year, and it's going to be in Brazil this year. The U.S., and I was at the one in Paris in 2015 when they signed the Paris and
Oh, wow.
yeah. So I've seen like the evolution of this, and I've seen how it goes when the U.S. is actively engaged with the process, and how it goes. The U.S. is disengaged from the process, and it's better for everyone when the U.S. is engaged because the U.S. is a major emitter. It's a major economy. It's an important ally for almost every Western country. And, it's competing economically with China, but the U.S. has diplomatic relations with everyone. The U.S. under the Trump administration, we almost certainly are going to pull out of the Paris Agreement probably on Monday of this coming week and be out for the next 4 years
Breaking
at
my
least.
heart.
So that's going to happen. And, so we're going to be out of that conversation, that global conversation. But as long as, there's going to still be this kind of economic activity around clean energy still happening in the U.S. that's coming from the IRA or coming from, whatever state governments or local governments are supporting, and just, what Wall Street wants to keep doing. This is a question about like what kind of leadership role does the U.S. want to still have? How much do we want from a national security and kind of geopolitics point of view? How much do we want to be driving the car here versus being pushed around by economic forces that we're not involved with? I mean, if the U.S. is checked out of the energy transition for the next like 5 or 6 years, we're going to come back after the next presidential election and realize that the gap in innovation and like manufacturing capacity between the US and China on this stuff right now is already huge. And if we're checked out for another 5 years, I mean, it's going to get to the point where you just can't catch up. Yeah. Arguably, we're like at that point already. So that's not in the US strategic advantage to be like shoved aside like that. I mean, we should be leading on this stuff. So encouragingly, that the guy, Chris Wright, who is Trump's nominee to lead the US Energy Department, had his confirmation hearing in the Senate on Wednesday of this week. And he basically said everything that I just said, which is that, acting on clean energy technology is an economic and geopolitical imperative for the US. I mean, he also wants the U.S. to be exporting a lot more natural gas and oil. So we'll see what happens with that. But he is a supporter of these new technologies as well. So I do think that's encouraging. So anyway, so we'll see what happens with U.S. leadership on this in the next 4 years.
That aside, what would you like to leave the listeners with if you had to give any piece of advice, any sort of framework to think about, in general, the listeners, what should they take away?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned before the role of individual action. And I'm always somewhat skeptical about how important are individual kind of choices around climate. What can we really do on an individual level, or how much is that kind of a distraction from these bigger systemic problems, whatever. But I do think there are some things that people can kind of do on a personal level that make a difference. And probably the most important one is vote. Get involved with your political process in the country or place that you live in. And if you have opinions about anything that we have just discussed in the last hour, you have to express those through the political process. And so that's the most important thing that people can do. And also I recommend people to just buy less stuff because I have a lot of stupid waste, and it's honestly a real drain on emissions and the whole. Don't waste food, don't waste stuff. You don't need to buy another shirt on Amazon. Just buy less crap and waste less. Those are all really important things that individuals can do.
That is also going on a pillow. Buy less crap, so on a pillow. Tim, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for breaking down, the Inflation Reduction Act in a way that makes it less about complicated legislation and more about what it means for all of us. But before we go, I've got to ask, if the IRA were a movie, what would the tagline be? I imagine something like, Republicans love it, they just don't know it yet. What do you think?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to beat that. That's good. It's here. Get used to it.
I love that. We should do more of that. But to be fair, I don't know why just this conversation made me think it should be Republicans love it. They just don't know it yet.
Everyone loves it. They just don't know yet. I mean, look, the part of the problem with the Inflation Reduction Act is a lot of Democratic voters in the U.S. have never heard of it either. I mean, they didn't do a great job of kind of promoting it. So there's a lot of people who are ideologically aligned with that, who they haven't heard of it either or haven't taken it. So I think everyone loves it. They just don't know it yet is also good for the movie.
Absolutely. I mean, climate change doesn't care what party you vote for, but policies like the IRA are a chance to do something about it. And for everyone listening, here's the takeaway. This isn't just about politics or the environment, like Tim has so eloquently put it. It's about jobs, clean air, building a better future for all of us, about innovation. It's about the 51 billion ton question, and are we ready to get this done? So whether you're in rural Texas, downtown LA, or you're chilling in Finland, shout out to our podcast listeners there, take a moment to think about what policies like this mean for you and how you can push for more action. Tim, thank you again for joining us today. Your insights have been supremely invaluable, and I hope you'll come back when we hit 1 billion tons down and have 50 billion more to go.
Sounds great. I'll be there.
You just heard Climate Conversations with Divya, brought to you by Purple Figs Productions. We hope today's episode sparked new ideas and deeper curiosity about how we can tackle climate change together. Until next time, this is Climate Conversations with Divya. Stay curious, stay engaged, and let's shape a sustainable future together.